Heads up, the following podcast contains adult language and deals with adult subjects. Keep this in mind as you listen. On with the show.
Hey folks, I'm Grace.
And I'm James. Welcome to Fundamental Shift, a podcast where we explore the major shakeups in our lives, their fault lines, and aftershocks.
Thanks for joining us.
On our first episode, we talked about being Zennials and how rad 1997 was when we graduated high school. We told you a little bit about how, like many of us, we reconnected on social media and found out we had a lot more in common now than we did in high school.
As we got to know each other this time around, we began talking about passion projects, and we realized they were in a very similar vein. And so we decided to collaborate on a podcast, which you're listening to now. But this isn't entirely about us. We invite you to join us in this collaboration, adding your own stories and experiences to the community. More on that later, but for now, on with the show.
So on the first episode, we got to hear my backstory and a little about my life now. Today, we're going to hear about Grace's history and a little about how life looks for her now. Okay, Grace, it's your turn. Tell us about how you grew up and what your family was like.
Well, I know you guys can't tell it from my accent, but I am definitely a child of the South. I was born an accidental turned Hail Mary baby to parents on the edge of divorce and a brother 9 years my senior. So when I was 3, my home broke. And after the divorce of my parents, we were in joint custody. My parents were, we'll call it quote unquote, saved in the Way movement of the 1970s. Some of you may recall Bibles with photos of smiling hippies and block letters on the cover, despite neither of my parents being hippies at all. Our church and school was a non-denominational quasi-commune, so we didn't live on the grounds. We lived in our own homes, but when we were there, everyone was your parent. And that was really kind of amazing in some ways. It definitely had merit, and I had the best godmother ever. But as with so many of these kinds of communities, it started with peace, love, and Jesus, and it ended with conflict, grief, and hubris. The pastor was the son of a Baptist preacher and the graduate of a Baptist seminary. So it still held many of the fundamental beliefs of the Baptists, just in Birkenstocks instead of suits. My mother remained with them, and my father ended up going to a more mainstream Baptist denominational congregation after their split. They were from really different backgrounds and ran different independent households. I had 2 very different worlds every time I switched environments. So for me, instead of one big shift here or there, it was constantly shifting from day to day, from week to week, whenever my schedule wasn't necessarily plotted out. So every time we switched, I was shifting yet again. So my mom was one of 6 kids from the country, and when her family came to the city, she tried to be the picture of 50s etiquette mixed with liberated 80s woman. So we're thinking 9 to 5 Dolly Parton's Dora Lee meets Betty Crocker. Now, this sounds kind of amazing, but the reality was much more complicated. Because she was so invested in appearances and the judgment of others, we really suffered a lack of parenting. We lived in an apartment in the inner city projects, and my mother worked a lot, and she also dated a lot. I was pretty much a latchkey kid, and at home I felt sort of part hired help, part spouse, and really nothing of a childhood. Sometimes she would almost play at mothering by entering me in beauty pageants, which were torture for me. There is picture evidence of this, unfortunately.
Patreon.
Patreon. She made all of my clothes. She did my hair and makeup, and she sent me to dancing classes for my talent. Now, while that's really pretty impressive, it's also indicative of her obsession with appearances. And due to the financial costs of being in a pageant, my mother spent so much time working on all of the wardrobe and other props I needed to compete. And this is time I would have much rather spent together doing even the simplest of things. Oh, and guys, no, I never won. By the time I entered my last year of elementary school, she moved in with a man. And between he and my brother, I was just on the back burner of her priorities. And so kind of switched to my dad now. He, on the other hand, came from a smaller two-sibling family, just he and his older brother. And though he was the baby, instead of being spoiled, he was pretty much shafted. His parents really openly favored his older brother. For example, they chose to send only one of them to college, and they chose his older brother even though they had the means for both of them to attend. My dad was the blue-collar worker. He worked as a fireman and had served in the Marine Corps. This combo made for a household run in military-like fashion. We lived in the country as opposed to the inner city projects in a modular home, and he was a vigilant parent to a fault in a way that ended up invading my privacy. Things like reading my mail, keeping tabs on me at all times with the beeper. I used 10 codes, which are first response dispatch codes. So I'd have to send him a 10-4, everything is okay, or when I got home from school, a 10-23, I have arrived, meaning I've arrived at home, to let him know where I was and what I was doing. It was great for safety, but it went over the top and it made me feel very tracked. I went to work early with a permit at 14. In addition to feeling part hired help, part spouse in his home, I was also part employee, running the admin side of things for his housemaking company. And though we had a complex dynamic, I knew he wanted me to have the opportunities he didn't get in his own upbringing. He married briefly for a second time, lasting only a year when I was 8-ish, and then again later in life for a third time. And contrary to my mother, I was always on his front burner, to the detriment of any and everything else. So I had this weird dynamic where I felt neglect from my mother and smothered by my father. The extremes were a constant shift. I never knew whether to feel dread about this or relief about it. My brother was pretty much out of control by 13. In spite of his drug abuse, violent actions, and his criminal behavior, he was somehow always the golden child. Because he was the older brother, was really reason enough where I grew up, because patriarchal culture inhabited every corner of life. Instead of having a sibling to get through all this with, I had an abuser and also a stalker. He would peer through windows as early as elementary school. In my 5th grade year, it was discovered he had been going on the roof and storing a bag of money and drugs on my elementary school roof. He continued this off and on throughout junior high and high school. He left predatory voice messages on my phone, particularly when I was away from home on any kind of trip. From school to church leadership, no one wanted to prosecute him. They wanted to reform him, to redeem him, and have Jesus have this awesome story, really at the expense of my safety. Honestly, at that age, I was so scared, though, of the implications, I was sort of relieved that they didn't. It was an unhealthy environment, but it was all I knew, and I really loved my family. So, as with all dysfunctional families, there are a lot of memory-building good times, vacations, reunions, holidays, mixed up with all of this fucked up shit, where you just, as a kid especially, don't know how to process that all, so you just kind of focus on the good part and leave the bad to the side. Yeah. And sometimes as an adult, you do the same. Particularly, I find when people pass, that can happen. So the abuse in my home was witnessed by many family members on all levels, but no consequence really ever came to him. Everyone just kind of chalked it up to his substance abuse and sent him to rehab just over and over. They thought he'd just fallen in with the wrong crowd, but he had a heart of gold. That was just something I heard constantly. I learned early on that I just would not get any protection in my family. Even my grandmothers who raised me alongside my parents and who were my ballast in the tempest of these storms just couldn't acknowledge his abuse toward me and gave him every benefit of the doubt. So, resigned to this fact, I retreated as often as possible into my own world. My mind and emotions numbed out to it all, and in that state of feeling helpless, I thought about the one thing I did have in my power and decided to do all I could to take advantage of that, and it was my education.
What were your school environments like growing up? I know for many of us, in addition to our family, teachers can have a fundamental impact on our worldview. What role did your education play in your formation during those early years?
Well, it was a huge role. I attended public school, elementary to junior high, and it was pure hell socially. But academically, for me, it was sheer heaven. I was basically this mini adult that none of my peers could relate to, and I couldn't relate to them either. And I envied their lives as children. But I connected with my instructors, and those relationships really just helped me survive. Their care and safety net for 6 hours a day absolutely saved my life. I loved engaging in learning without fear and just not having any other thought during that period of time besides what I was focusing on at school. I loved the reward of earning good grades, and I lived these years looking ahead to when I turned 18 and I could further my education and make a better life on my own. In those 6 hours, I could just drop my guard a little and open my mind and my heart before locking them back down at home. Again, that constant shift. One teacher in particular taught me the importance of storytelling. And as a member of the Cherokee Nation, he opened my worldview to other ancient spiritual practices and beliefs. He taught me about the creation story of Coyote, which is one of my absolute favorites, and it's lasted with me. He showed me the joy of interacting with cultures of all kinds, and particularly through their stories, learning about them in that way. And though I'd been exposed to the knowledge, there were many ways to practice faith. I still held to the Baptist faith that my father was training me in. I started Christian clubs and did stateside missions. As a family, we attended the uber patriarchal, guys think Duggar's 19 and counting here. I had the long hair and the skirts and all that good stuff. Institute of Basic Life Principles yearly. And this is where I was reminded to remain under the authority of a man my whole life through. Whereas my brother did drugs to exercise his demons, I did Jesus to cope. And when it came to time to enter high school, my education and religious life converged. I began attending Calvary Christian School, where I would meet you, my co-host James, and my junior year. Once again, teachers would play a pivotal role as mentors in addition to educators. I know probably to you and to the rest of our peers, I just looked like a teacher's pet. But for me, those relationships were very much about survival. Even with the spiritual component, though, I hated high school. I still felt out of place and unrelatable and too old to hang with the kids and too young to hang with the adults and just, again, stuck out like a sore thumb. At this time, I was also volunteering for a women's ministry that my father had intentionally taken me to for apprenticeship on godly womanhood, which is a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
The only thing lasting that I got out of that, besides regret, was my best friend and chosen family, who, spoiler alert, we will hear from in a later episode.
Yay!
So I remained in that ministry and got sort of adopted, so to speak, by a staff member and her family, and attended a 2-year college aiming for a nursing degree so I could serve in medical missions. Mostly I just wanted to end up on a mercy ship. So I ended up leaving just shy of my degree. And this was mostly due to the fact that I had just started to deal with the history of my abuse. And I just needed a break and lots of therapy. And when I did decide to go back to college, that staff member who had taken me under her wing wrote a letter aiding in a significant scholarship grant to Montreat College.
Wow.
And Montreat is located in the hotbed of American evangelicalism, the home and headquarters of the one and only door-to-door brush salesman turned crusader, Billy Graham. I could literally turn around at church and he may be in the pew behind me, which did indeed happen. My history professor collaborated and continues to write books with Newt Gingrich. This was a politically charged world inextricably linked with its spirituality. I had grown up that way, so it wasn't really anything that struck me particularly at the time. I look back at it now and think, oh my God. But at the time, it didn't really strike me very much at all. Republican and Christian were, and still are in many places, interchangeable. As early as 7 years old, I can remember attending the 1984 Republican National Convention to re-elect Reagan Bush, sitting above the crowd on my father's shoulders. So this was nothing new to me. In the midst of this evangelical mainstream Protestant kingdom, I branched out and explored many other denominations and traditions, really thought not Christian by evangelicals. Even if they said they were, many evangelical Christians would just think that they were deceived. So we're thinking folks like Orthodox churches, liturgical churches in particular. So as a major in Bible and religion, I was inundated with doctrinal dogma and apologetics. Up with us and our one and only true way, and down with all the rest and their hell-bound hedonism. It was just very black and white. There was no in between. So while I was still drinking the Kool-Aid, I didn't check my brain at the door, and it never sat easy with me. When I wasn't babysitting for Billy Graham's great-grandchildren, I sought advice from liberal female pastors in the area. I was questioning, and after the constant shifting of my childhood, I experienced my first major standalone fundamental shift in adulthood here, when I learned how the Bible came to be canonized. It totally rocked my world, and it made me livid at the same time, and you can probably hear it in my voice. It still does.
Yeah.
Knowing that the books that compromise the authoritative Word of God were compiled by committees of men, voting and choosing and debating on them, with the same clay feet as you and me, we humans today, made me doubt everything. I'd grown up thinking the word spoken and dictated was absolutely and indisputably fact, and I believed all of the literal claims that a person is compelled to hold based on this fact. Like we mentioned before, a 6-day creation, for instance.
Yep.
My anger came from, and remains for me, what is a betrayal and a swindling of congregations by seminary-trained pastors who have learned this knowledge. I learned, and is, quite frankly, Google will tell you. And yet they keep saying it was indeed dropped from the very voice, if not finger of God. And still I soldiered on in the army of the Lord. I'd built my whole life around this calling to ministry and to missions, and what the hell would I do or be without it?
What did life look like after your school years moving into career life?
Well, after graduation, I spent several years working in social services, in Christian secondary education, and also at a Christian law firm. I fully intended on going to seminary for ordained ministry as a career, but I kept getting blocked. The first process was blocked due to the denomination debating women's ordination and coming down on the no side. And then the second process was blocked due to the denomination debating LGBTQIA ordination and coming down in a split with my particular parish on the side of no. So at this point, I'd given all I had in volunteer ministry every time the doors were open between church and parachurch organizations. I was frankly exhausted, and I felt very defeated. And on top of all of this, my father and grandmother were dying of cancer. So I assisted in their care, and in the midst of it had to locate my brother, who had now been MIA for a decade. And I was fine for him to be MIA, but of course, felt that we need to get him back to say goodbye to his family members, and that fell on my shoulders. And on top of that, I decided, hey, it's a great time to go to massage therapy school as a plan B to ordination. I saw it as I saw it as a ministry of a different sort. At least it was healing arts. At least it was helping people. And little did I know, really, that I went there as much for myself as I did for anyone else's care. While I was there, I had my next big fundamental shift when I finally came out to myself. We talk a lot about coming out to others, but no one really tells you how hard it is to come out to yourself. You know it in the back of your consciousness, but accepting it on your own and all it will cost you to come out to others, especially in a fundamental community, is just daunting. The thing about fundamental communities is it feels so damn good when you're really in it, and they take care of their own. Their dysfunction is precisely what makes them such a powerful voice. And I was at a loss for what I'd do without hymn sings and prayers and hugs from my brothers and sisters in Christ and retreats to share what the Lord had laid on my heart. And oh, the casseroles. So many casseroles.
Yeah, the casseroles. So, yeah, that's a lot to deal with. And as a queer woman who came up in Southern American fundamentalism, you faced so many roadblocks on your path to finally breaking away and living an authentic life. Was there a moment, one final straw that broke the camel's back?
I'm not sure there was one, but there was certainly a season of time. In the midst of these ordination rejections, I buried both of my loved ones who had died of cancer. And though those were complicated relationships, they were also the ones primary in raising me. And losing them within months of each other was gut-wrenching. And, I just felt incredibly distant from my family. Per usual, my brother, though gone for that decade, while I was taking care of my family and denying myself on so many levels, he was just accepted with open arms. The prodigal son had returned home by really everyone. And on the other hand, I felt pushed to the side, and deep down, during those funerals, I was not just mourning the dead. I was mourning in real time my living family and the Christian family I knew I was losing at that very moment. It was like a living wake for me. And that was really the moment that another shift came over me. I went home, took off my pantsuit, put on my overalls, Googled #1 lesbian city in America, and made a plan to move there. So after graduation from massage therapy school, it was Portland, Oregon or bust. And in the meanwhile, I don't know why, but I decided to give church and ordination one last go. I suppose I needed 3 strikes to complete the full set. So after all, as I said before, I'd prepared my whole life for it. I'd never been to a full affirming LGBTQIA church. In my world, those churches were misguided, if not plants from Satan himself, if they could even be considered a real church at all. They were certainly lost, and, I say that that's the term for normal people if you don't speak Christianese. So even though I'd come out to myself and didn't believe in Christianity as an end-all be-all, I was certainly a universalist by this time. Going there for the first time was uncomfortable because it was just unknown. And to dip my toes back in the water, I attended an early service I saw posted that attracted spiritual folks of all stripes into a sacred space. By the time I left, I don't think I'd ever been more comfortable in church. They were the first people I ever came out to and would love me through my next big fundamental shift to coming out to others now that I'd come out to myself. So really now came the point where I'd come out to myself, I'd come out to others, and now it was time to come out to God. And, or maybe God came out to me. Once I gotten to know these accepting, loving people, I began sharing some music there. And one Sunday, I arrived early, and I was sitting in the first pew. I bowed my head, mostly really just to quiet myself. Out of nowhere, as we say, the still small voice came. And it just was this very clear, what felt to me audible, "You're not going to hell." And maybe it was inside me. It surely felt outside of me, but we humans can conjure many a thing, and I'm well aware of that. All I know is I wasn't trying, and I wasn't crying at an altar like so many times before, where I'd begged and begged and begged God to speak to me and never heard an answer. It just came out of the blue. And this experience really fundamentally shifted for me the rest of my life away from that angry God with sinners in his hand to one of love and many faces. And I did indeed move, and that short season in Portland was a mix of bliss and grief. I ended up moving back within months. I had unfinished business. My mother was ill at this point. My brother was living with her. I needed to come out here in my hometown and deal with the consequences. I needed to process all of the loss in my life, from family members and friends to dashed dreams and career and ministry. I lost most of my family when I came out, and my mother judged me quite harshly despite her own failings and those of my brother. That was quite the hypocritical blow, but I had done what I came to do. I tied the loose ends, and there was no longer anything hanging over my head, and I could live fully in my truth. So I decided to go back to that church where I had been so embraced. It was the season of Lent, and I attended an Ash Wednesday service where I met my now wife. I spent the next year with my then girlfriend, now wife, as members of that congregation after my return to my home city. It became clear during that time that it was just way too soon to be ministering to anyone when I was really the one who needed ministry. Okay, therapy. I was ill-prepared with all of the grief and transition in my life, and shedding the rhetoric of my past proved to be the most difficult task of all. Due to missteps on both sides, we parted ways after that year full of joy and pain. I was a wreck for a good year. Now the shelf had really broken. There was no other path to a career in ministry, and in accepting that, I started to feel something unexpected. Peace. I realized I just didn't believe in the way that a pastor must. I couldn't rationalize it because of all the education I'd had or the conduit of good it could be. We were able to make amends with the leadership, and I ended up being grateful because it turns out, after all of the struggle, that ordination was really the best thing that never happened.
So there are folks listening to your story right now who may be closeted or in some state of transition or contemplation regarding whether and how to come out and to whom. What can you share about how that process unfolded in your life and any lessons you may have learned along the way?
Well, I'm leaning into middle age now, and I am comfortable in my own skin. But that took time and lots of mistakes and lots of therapy. I have found my worth outside of a career, and I love making the home that I never had, one of peace and safety. I've grown into my own spiritual practice, and I also have respect for a completely atheist philosophy. I'm a both and person. I'm forever a student. I love exploring and traveling, And I still love studying religion, believe it or not. I'm not talking abusive fundamental systems, but rather the mystic creative beauty of sacred wisdom. I've learned many lessons along the way, and here are a couple of the most important. First, accept everything about yourself, even if some things seem contradictory. I'm not talking about excuse or indulgent. You have to own your own shit, good and bad. And for some of us, owning the good is actually harder than owning the bad at times. I'm talking about simple acceptance that lets you really know yourself. I find it allows me to trust myself and to work with the not so good in my life from a place of peace. For quite some time, I felt so disconnected from who I was and who I am. So the second thing is that I made a concerted effort to understand and integrate my past and present selves from these two entities into one whole person moving forward. So while I'm no longer that hyper-religious, black and white, either or, insecure girl who would absolutely turn me off now, I love and accept her. I understand that she needed to be that at the time to cope. I don't beat her up. I don't hate on her because she's part of me. I also don't excuse many of the choices that I made at that time. And taking responsibility for them makes me stronger. Moving forward with actions to repair those choices has brought me so much joy, and in many cases, healing for me and others. I do want to say here that there is no perfect time or place, no perfect formula for coming out, whatever your coming out may be. Maybe it's orientation, or gender-related, or maybe it's coming out non-religious in a very religious community. Saying I'm not a Christian was way harder many times in my case than saying I'm a lesbian. The important thing is that you do it your way, in your time, and that you do it safely. If it is not safe to come out where you are openly, please take advantage of online resources and any other local places of sanctuary, like an affirming house of worship, an LGBTQIA hangout, or business, social media, or meetup groups. We will link some of these resources in the show notes, and we are a safe place for you as well. I took advantage of these kinds of resources years before I came out, and at least I was seen there, if not in the rest of my life.
So be safe. Find safe spaces where you can be seen and heard and understood for who you are.
Absolutely.
So to wrap up, tell us, Grace, what's life like now?
Well, Amy and I have now been married happily for 4 years legally, 9 years by ceremony, and together 11 years. We've had much to overcome in that time. Unemployment, many moves, job changes, health concerns, the same things many of us have to deal with. Family deaths of my mother and brother, my father-in-law, beloved pets, tragic deaths of friends suffering from mental illness, life's decisions that we still talk about, like children. And as much as those things can weigh on us heavily, our spirits have been lifted with so many wonderful things. Our chosen family has grown as I reconnected with my god sister. I had the privilege of officiating her marriage to her partner. We are aunts, and even great aunts. Our friends are the kind with whom you discuss all the topics you're supposed to avoid in polite society. We reside in our hometown with sights on those beautiful westward mountains one day. And through it all, we remember that Ash Wednesday admonition. You are dust, and to dust you shall return. It keeps us ever mindful of the cycle of life and death on a micro as well as macro plane. And today I live in yet another fundamental shift I never saw coming. Happiness. Well, now that you've heard from us, we want to hear from you. Here's how you can reach us.
On Facebook and YouTube, simply search for Fundamental Shift Podcast or check out our website, www.funshiftpod.com.
Email us at funshiftpod funshiftpod@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 704-665-7473.
On Twitter and Instagram, you can find us at FunShiftPod and fun.shift.pod, respectively.
We look forward to responding to your messages on the next show. Until then, remember folks, shift happens.